It was supposed to be a peaceful vacation for a single mom and her daughter after a long, stressful year of juggling work and life, but as they stepped into the crowded airport terminal, things already felt off. The flight was packed to the brim, and the long queues only seemed to make everything worse. She tried to reassure her daughter that they'd be fine, but the nagging thought in the back of her mind just wouldn't go away. When they finally reached the gate, the mom couldn't help but feel a little uneasy when she looked at their boarding passes again. Something wasn't right. The seats they had booked were supposed to be together, but when she glanced at the seating chart on the screen, her stomach twisted. They were seated several rows apart. Her daughter was just 8 and had a fear of flying that no amount of encouragement or stickers could ease. She'd gotten better over the years, but the thought of sitting so far away from her mom on a crowded flight filled her with dread. She tried to calm herself, taking a deep breath and focusing on the moment. She couldn't afford to panic yet, not with her daughter watching her every move. They began boarding, and the mom could feel the tension building with every step they took towards the plane. She smiled at her daughter, trying to push the fear down, but every time she looked at the little girl's anxious face, her heart broke a little more. As they reached their seats, she saw the issue more clearly than ever. There was no way they could sit together. The mom could seat her daughter in her assigned row a few seats down, and felt a cold rush of panic flood through her body. She took a deep breath and squeezed her daughter's hand one last time before reluctantly walking up the aisle to speak with the flight attendant. She approached the woman with a polite but strained smile and explained the situation, asking if there was any way they could be seated together. The flight attendant looked her up and down with a cold expression, and then quickly glanced at the seating chart. "I'm sorry, but this is a full flight. There's nothing I can do," the attendant said, her voice flat and dismissive. The mom felt a pang of frustration, but tried to remain composed. "Please, I'm just asking to be with my daughter. She's scared of flying, and I really don't want her to be alone." The mom's voice shook slightly with the stress of it all, but the attendant didn't seem to notice. She simply shrugged. "You should have thought about this when you booked your tickets," the attendant replied with a sharp laugh. "What do you expect me to do about it now?" The mom stood there stunned. The words stung far more than she expected. It was like a slap in the face, and for a moment she couldn't think of what to say next. The attendant's dismissive attitude left her speechless, and for the first time in a long time the mom felt small and powerless. She turned away without another word and walked back to her seat, feeling a deep wave of embarrassment wash over her. As she sat down, the reality of the situation hit her. The flight was now fully boarding, and there was no chance of any other changes. She was stuck, and her daughter was still terrified, sitting far away from her. She tried to focus on something positive, anything to stop her mind from spiraling, but the fear in her daughter's eyes was all she could see. The mom reached over to squeeze her hand, but even that felt like it wasn't enough. The noise of the plane starting to taxi down the runway only made things worse. It was all happening so quickly, and she had no control. All she could do now was hope that somehow the next few hours would pass quickly and without incident, but deep down she knew that wasn't going to be the case, not with her daughter so afraid, and the lingering feeling that they were completely alone in this battle. The plane began to hum as it taxied down the runway, but the mom couldn't focus on the sounds of the engines or the chatter of the other passengers. All she could think about was the space between her and her daughter. The small voice in her head kept asking how this had happened. Why was she so far away from the one person who needed her most, and why hadn't the flight attendant been more understanding? She glanced over at her daughter, who was staring out the window, now her small face pale, her hands tightly gripping the armrest. It made her stomach twist, but the mom tried to push it all aside. She couldn't let herself fall apart, not now, not in front of her daughter. She took another deep breath and stood up, clutching her seatbelt tightly. She had to do something. This was her responsibility. This was her daughter's safety and emotional well-being, and she couldn't let a flight attendant's dismissive attitude ruin their entire journey. She scanned the cabin again, The space was still tight, but there had to be someone who could help this time. She wouldn't take no for an answer, not when her daughter needed her. With a sense of determination, she made her way back down the aisle and approached the flight attendant. Once more this time, she was prepared, her voice steadier, more insistent. "Excuse me, I really need to be seated with my daughter. It's a matter of her emotional well-being. She's afraid of flying, and she's getting more anxious by the minute." The attendant barely glanced at her before answering with a sigh, "I already told you there's nothing I can do." The mom felt her frustration bubble to the surface. She forced herself to remain calm, even though her heart was pounding. "Please, you have to understand she's just a little girl, and she's scared. I can't leave her alone like this." The attendant rolled her eyes. "I don't have time for this, lady. You'll have to sort it out when we land," she said, and turned away without another word. The mom stood there for a moment, frozen. Her hands were trembling now, and she could feel the heat rise in her face. The feeling of humiliation was overwhelming. She turned back to her seat, but this time the sting of rejection hit her harder than before. She glanced at her daughter, who was now looking back at her, her eyes wide with confusion and worry. "Mommy, are you okay?" her daughter asked in a soft voice, and it was all the mom could do not to break down. She forced a smile and nodded. "I'm fine, sweetie, just a little tired. We're almost there, okay?" Her daughter didn't seem convinced, but she nodded and returned to staring out the window, her tiny face scrunched in concentration, trying to make sense of what was happening. The mom sat down beside her and took a deep breath. The noise of the engines felt louder now. Her mind raced as she thought about the situation. How much longer could she endure this feeling of helplessness? Her daughter was so scared, and here she was unable to do anything. Then something unexpected happened. The mom heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching the back of the plane. The flight attendant was moving down the aisle again, but this time her steps were slower, more deliberate. The mom's pulse quickened. Was she about to get another cold dismissal? Was she going to have to sit here and watch her daughter suffer while the crew ignored them? But then the attendant stopped just in front of her seat and stood there for a moment, as if weighing her options. The mom's heart skipped a beat, and she held her breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The flight attendant stood in front of the mom's seat for what felt like an eternity. Without saying a word, her posture was stiff and distant, almost as if she were waiting for the mom to speak first. But the mom was done with asking. She was done with being polite and patient. She had tried everything. The mom's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms, trying to suppress the rising wave of frustration that threatened to overtake her. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say anything, the attendant broke the silence with a sharp laugh that made the mom's stomach turn. "Lady, I don't know what you want me to do about this. There's no way we can move people around. This plane is packed," she said. The mom felt her face flush with embarrassment, but she refused to back down. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about her daughter's safety, her daughter's peace of mind, her daughter's well-being. "Please, she's only 8, and she's terrified. She needs me with her. I just want to be able to sit next to her." The mom's voice was shaking now, but she tried to steady it as best as she could. The flight attendant looked at her with a mixture of annoyance and indifference. "I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do," she said, her voice cold and dismissive. She didn't even make eye contact, her eyes scanning over the cabin like the mom didn't matter at all. The mom felt a sharp pang in her chest. It was as if the attendant hadn't even heard her. She wanted to scream, but she couldn't. She wouldn't, not in front of her daughter, and not in front of all these strangers. "I understand it's a full flight, but please, there must be something you can do." The mom pleaded, her heart racing now. She could feel the tears threatening to spill, but she pushed them back, fighting to stay composed. The attendant's lips curled into a slight smirk. "Maybe next time you should book better seats," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You know, this could have been avoided if you planned ahead." The mom stood there in shock, her mind racing. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Was this really happening? She had heard of rude flight attendants before. But this was something else. It was as if the woman was mocking her pain, making light of her anxiety and her daughter's fear. "Excuse me," the mom said, her voice barely a whisper, but the words felt like they were burning her throat. "My daughter is scared. I don't care about your seat assignments. I care about her well-being." The words felt like they were coming from someone else, like she wasn't even in control. Anymore, the mom's voice trembled. But there was a quiet fury beneath the surface. The attendant didn't respond. She just turned and walked away with a shrug, her cold smile still lingering. The mom stood there for a moment, staring after her, unsure of what to do next. The cabin felt suffocating, now the air heavy with the tension between them. She walked back to her seat as quickly as she could, her heart pounding, her mind spinning, trying to process the encounter. She wanted to say something to her daughter, something reassuring, but the words wouldn't come. She sat down next to her daughter, who was looking up at her with wide eyes. "Are we okay, Mommy?" her daughter asked softly. The mom nodded, but it felt like a lie. She didn't feel okay. She didn't feel anything but a rising sense of helplessness. She glanced down the aisle at the flight attendant, who was now walking away again with a casual indifference. It was clear there would be no help from her. The mom settled back into her seat, defeated, feeling completely alone in the crowded cabin. The only sound now was the low hum of the engines and the quiet murmur of the passengers around them. But to the mom it felt like everything was closing in. She wasn't sure how much longer she could hold it together. The mom sat back in her seat, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on her, her hands still trembling from the exchange with the flight attendant, and the silence between her and her daughter felt unbearable. Now her daughter had returned to staring out the window, but the mom could see the subtle signs of fear in her face, the way her little fingers gripped the armrest, her eyes wide. And unblinking, the mom's heart broke all over again. She wanted so badly to hold her close, to reassure her, but she couldn't even do that. She couldn't reach her across the aisle. The sound of the engines roared louder as the plane climbed higher and higher into the sky. The cabin air grew thin, and the mom could feel the pressure in her chest tightening. With every passing minute she glanced at the flight attendants, who were now walking up and down the aisle preparing for the in-flight service. But none of them even looked at her, not once. No one cared, no one offered to help. The mom felt small, invisible. It was as if she and her daughter were just another set of passengers to be ignored in this sea of strangers. She leaned back in her seat, trying to calm herself, but the anxiety was too much, the fear for her daughter too overwhelming. She needed to fix this. But she didn't know how. The thought of her daughter being alone in that seat filled her with panic. But no one was offering a solution. She had no control over this situation, and it was maddening. Suddenly she heard the door to the cockpit open and footsteps echoed down the aisle. It was a sound that caught her attention. Immediately she looked up and saw the captain walking through the cabin, his uniform crisp and his stride confident. He wasn't rushing, he was moving with purpose. But it was the way he looked at her that made her heart race. He wasn't just another passenger or crew member. He looked directly at her as he walked past, and his eyes seemed to soften just slightly before moving on. Then, as if on instinct, he stopped just a few feet from her seat and turned his gaze back to her, his voice calm and steady. "Is everything all right?" He asked. The question was simple, but there was something in his tone that made her pause for a moment. She hadn't expected this. From the captain, she had expected indifference, or perhaps a brief polite exchange. But his voice carried a weight that made her feel like he actually cared. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words got stuck in her throat. The rush of emotion was too much. She fought to stay composed, but it wasn't easy. "My daughter, she's terrified of flying, and I can't be with her." She stammered, her hands shaking as she gestured toward the empty seat across the aisle. "I tried to explain, but the flight attendants won't help, and she's so scared, she's so alone." The captain nodded, his expression thoughtful, and then without saying a word he turned toward the front of the plane. The mom blinked, unsure of what was happening. Was he going to call someone? Was he going to finally do something? Moments passed in tense silence, and then the captain returned, walking down the aisle with purpose, his eyes locked on hers. And this time there was no doubt in his mind. What he was about to do, he stopped in front of the mom and nodded toward the seat beside her. "Follow me," he said in a tone that brooked no argument. The mom's heart skipped a beat, and for the first time in what felt like hours she felt a glimmer of hope. She stood up quickly, trying to steady herself. She didn't know what was happening, but she followed the captain down the aisle, not daring to look back. She didn't want to get her hopes up, but the small flicker of relief was enough to push her forward. Her daughter was still in her seat, her eyes watching the exchange with curiosity and uncertainty, but the mom had no time to explain, not yet. The captain walked her to the back of the plane to an area where a few empty seats sat, and he turned to her with a reassuring smile. "You and your daughter can sit here together for the rest of the flight," he said, his voice warm and sincere. The mom felt the flood of relief hit her all at once, and she blinked back tears of gratitude. She didn't even know what to say. She just nodded quickly, her voice caught in her throat as she mouthed a silent thank you. The mom followed the captain to the back of the plane, her steps quick but uncertain. Her heart was racing faster than it had all day as they moved toward the empty row at the rear of the cabin. She glanced over her shoulder and saw her daughter watching her with wide eyes. The little girl still looked nervous, but there was a flicker of hope now in her gaze. It was as if she too sensed that something was finally changing. But the mom couldn't take her eyes off the captain. Not yet, not until she knew for sure what was going to happen. When they reached the empty seats, the captain stopped and turned to her, his expression kind and steady. He gestured for her to sit in the seat beside the window. "You and your daughter can stay here for the rest of the flight," he said, his voice firm but gentle. The mom's breath caught in her throat. It felt like the air had been knocked out of her. For a moment she just stood there staring at him, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her mind was spinning as she processed his words. This was really happening, wasn't it? She blinked rapidly, trying to fight the sudden wave of emotion that washed over her. She had been so close to giving up just a few moments ago. The despair had felt overwhelming. And now here she was being given exactly what she had prayed for, a chance to sit next to her daughter. She could hardly believe it. But there it was, the captain had stepped in when no one else would. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely above her breath, her throat tight with gratitude. The captain nodded and smiled slightly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "It's no trouble at all," he said with a quiet confidence that made the mom feel a little lighter. She sat down quickly beside the window, her hands shaking slightly as she buckled her seatbelt. She couldn't believe how simple it had seemed in the end, yet it had felt like an eternity to get here. She glanced over at her daughter, who was now sitting quietly in her seat, her face less tense, her small hands no longer clutching the armrest in fear. The little girl was still looking at her mom with wide eyes, but there was a sense of calm settling in her expression. Now she hadn't said a word since the captain spoke, but the mom could tell that the anxiety in her daughter was slowly starting to melt away. The mom reached over and gently took her daughter's hand in hers, squeezing it tightly. "We're together now, sweetie, we're safe," she said, her voice soft and reassuring. The little girl nodded, her face still pale, but the fear seemed to be slowly fading. As the plane leveled out and the hum of the engines settled into a steady rhythm, the mom leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes for just a moment, trying to absorb the relief that was finally starting to settle in her chest. She could still feel the weight of everything that had happened, the stress, the anxiety, but now there was a warmth spreading through her, the kind that comes with knowing you finally found a solution when all seemed lost. And then she remembered the captain, his unexpected kindness, and his willingness to stand up when no one else would. She looked around at the other passengers who were settling into their own seats and thought for a moment about how easy it could have been for everyone to ignore her. But the captain hadn't ignored her. He had taken action, and in doing so had made all the difference in the world to her and her daughter. The mom finally allowed herself to breathe a little easier as she looked out the window watching the clouds drift by below them. She couldn't control everything, but at least for now they were together and safe, and that was all that mattered in this moment. The mom sat back in her seat, still holding her daughter's hand, her fingers lightly tracing circles on the small palm. As if grounding herself in the moment, the flight had settled into a rhythm, and the sounds of the engines were soothing, almost comforting. The pressure in her chest was finally beginning to ease, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lingering in the air, a sense of gratitude mixed with disbelief. She kept thinking back to the captain, how he had stepped in when no one else had, how he had seen beyond the rules and schedules, and taken a moment to listen to her. How rare was that in the world today? She glanced over at her daughter, who had finally relaxed enough to lean her head against the seat back, her eyes now half closed. The mom smiled softly, watching her drift into a peaceful sleep. The weight of the day had finally caught up to her little girl. The mom allowed herself a small sigh of relief, but her mind couldn't stop replaying everything that had happened, the frustration, the helplessness, the tension, and then the unexpected kindness that had turned everything around. It was almost too much to process in one sitting, but it had happened, and she was still trying to make sense of it. The mom's gaze wandered down the aisle toward the front of the plane, where the flight attendants were still busy with their duties, but this time her eyes weren't filled with anger or resentment. Instead, she felt a strange sense of understanding. She had been so focused on the wrongs that had happened earlier that she hadn't considered the bigger picture. Sometimes people were just doing their jobs, trying to get through the day, and sometimes the stress of their own lives made it hard to offer the compassion she had desperately needed. But not the captain. He had seen through it all, and acted in a way that had made all the difference. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden shift in the cabin lights, and a soft voice over the intercom, announcing that the flight would be serving drinks and snacks. Soon the mom wasn't particularly hungry, but the thought of her daughter waking up to a friendly gesture made her feel a little better. She reached for the small tray in front of her to organize the space for when the snack service arrived, but just as she was about to adjust her seatbelt, she noticed something strange in the aisle. A small movement, a flash of light catching her eye. She looked up to see a man standing near the front of the plane, his eyes scanning the rows of seats. It was subtle at first, but then she realized what he was doing. He was looking directly at her, no one else, just her. And as his eyes locked with hers, a strange sense of recognition swept over her, but she couldn't place it. The man stepped forward slowly, and as he got closer, he smiled at her. It wasn't a broad grin, but something more genuine, something quiet and knowing. And that's when it hit her. He was one of the passengers from earlier, the one who had been seated across the aisle from her. When all the chaos was happening, he had been there the whole time, watching the flight attendant dismiss her, watching her struggle. And now here he was standing in the aisle just a few feet away from her, his expression soft and reassuring as he spoke in a low voice. "Are you all right now?" he asked, his tone full of concern. For a moment, the mom couldn't speak. She was so taken aback by his presence and his question. But then she found her voice and nodded. "Yes, thank you for asking. We're doing better now," she said, her voice shaky but sincere. The man nodded and glanced over at her daughter, still peacefully asleep beside her. "I'm glad to hear that," he said simply before turning to walk away, but not before offering one last smile that seemed to carry with it an unspoken understanding, like he had seen the struggle and wanted to acknowledge it in his own way. The mom watched him disappear into the crowd of passengers, and as she sat there with her daughter still sleeping beside her, she realized that sometimes kindness comes in unexpected forms, from places you least expect it. People may not always know the full story, but the small moments of recognition and understanding can make all the difference. The mom sat back in her seat, still processing the interaction with the man who had checked on them earlier. His presence had been brief, But the gesture had been enough to make her feel like maybe she wasn't as invisible as she had thought it was, as if someone in the crowd had finally noticed her struggle and cared enough to make sure she was okay for the first time in hours. The weight in her chest seemed to lift just a little. The simple act of kindness from a stranger felt like a lifeline. She glanced down at her daughter, whose face was now relaxed in sleep, her small body curled into the seat like a tiny bowl of comfort. The mom ran her fingers gently through her daughter's hair, feeling the warmth of her breath against her hand. And for a moment, everything felt right again. Everything felt normal, as if the world outside the plane had disappeared completely. It was just the two of them together and safe. The flight attendants continued to move up and down the aisles, delivering snacks and drinks to the passengers. But the mom couldn't help but notice how different everything felt now. The noise of the cabin had settled into the background. Her mind was clearer. She had been on edge for so long that it was hard to accept how quickly the tension had melted away. She had been consumed by fear and frustration just a few moments ago, and now she was sitting here in calm silence, watching her daughter sleep peacefully beside her. It was almost like a dream, but she knew it wasn't. Everything had changed because of that one moment when the captain had stepped in when no one else had cared enough to listen, and that single act had set everything in motion. It was amazing how much a small change could affect the course of an entire journey, how one person's decision could alter the path of a moment that felt like it might spiral into chaos. But now here she was sitting in the back of the plane with her daughter beside her, and the world around them seemed a little brighter. It felt like a small victory. The mom smiled softly to herself, grateful for the unexpected kindness she had received, but also aware of how fragile it all was, how quickly things could have gone wrong, how easily she could have been trapped in the anxiety of the situation, if not for the intervention of a few good people. She looked down the aisle again at the other passengers, who were all focused on their own little worlds. None of them seemed to notice the quiet relief that had settled over her, but it didn't matter anymore. She had learned something today, something valuable, something that would stick with her long after this flight was over. Kindness mattered. It didn't matter if it came from a flight attendant or a stranger in the seat across the aisle or even the captain. It was the small things that made the difference in the end, the things people did when they saw someone in need and chose to act. The plane continued its steady flight through the sky, the hours stretching on, but the mom didn't mind anymore. She didn't feel trapped or alone. She didn't feel like a victim to the circumstances. She had been given a chance to reset, a chance to find her ground again, and to see that even in moments of struggle, there were still people who cared, and that made all the difference. As the plane began its descent toward their destination, the mom felt a sense of peace wash over her. She had no idea what awaited her once they landed, but she knew this moment would stay with her forever. The memory of a flight that had started with anxiety and fear, but had ended with gratitude and connection. The plane began its final descent toward the airport, and the mom couldn't help but look out the window, watching the lights below them grow larger. As they neared the ground, the tension she had felt earlier seemed a distant memory. Now she could still feel the warmth of her daughter's hand in hers. But now there was a quiet peace that replaced the anxiety of the hours. Before the descent was smooth, the steady hum of the engines, a soothing sound as they glided through the air. Her daughter stirred beside her, rubbing her eyes and blinking up at the mom with a sleepy smile. "Are we almost there, Mommy?" she asked in a small voice. The mom smiled back gently, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Almost, sweetie, we're almost there," she replied, her voice soft and full of the calm she had been searching for since they had boarded the plane. The little girl nodded and snuggled closer to her mom, clearly still tired, but comforted by the presence of her mom beside her. The mom looked down at her daughter for a moment, taking in the peacefulness of the moment, how much it had changed in such a short time. She had come on this flight with so much fear and doubt, but now she was finally able to sit back and breathe. The flight had been long, but now She felt a sense of accomplishment that was hard to describe. She had made it through the hardest part, and had done everything she could to make sure her daughter was okay, and for that she felt proud. As the plane touched down with a soft jolt, and the wheels connected with the tarmac, the mom's heart gave a small leap. It was over. They had made it. They had survived the flight. And she had her daughter beside her, safe and sound. She exhaled deeply as the plane slowed down, the seatbelt sign flickering off, and the passengers around them began to gather their things. But the mom stayed seated for a moment, her hands still holding her daughter's, the world around her slowly coming back into focus. For a moment, the mom didn't want to move. She didn't want to leave the safety of her seat and the calm that had finally settled into her soul. It had been such a long journey emotionally, and she didn't want to rush back into the chaos of landing, the bustle of the airport, the long lines, the uncertainty of what would come next. For now, she just wanted to stay in this quiet moment with her daughter and hold on to the peace that had arrived so unexpectedly. The aisle began to empty as passengers disembarked one by one, but the mom stayed seated until everyone had left the plane. She was in no hurry to leave this moment, no hurry to let go of the quiet satisfaction that had settled over her. She felt a deep gratitude for the small acts of kindness that had carried her through the flight, for the captain's unexpected intervention, and for the strangers' quiet support. But most of all, she felt grateful for her daughter's safety, for their shared resilience in the face of uncertainty. Finally, the last of the passengers left the plane, and the mom stood up with her daughter in tow. She grabbed their bags and headed toward the exit, the familiar hum of the airport now greeting them. She felt a gentle but undeniable sense of calm wash over her as she stepped into the busy terminal. It was time to go home, but now it felt like a homecoming, in more ways than one, a return to normalcy, to safety, and to the promise that no matter what life brought their way, they would always have each other. As they walked through the terminal together, the mom glanced down at her daughter, who was holding her hand tightly and smiling up at her, the little girl's eyes shining with excitement. "Mommy, we made it," she said with a giggle. The mom smiled back with a heart full of gratitude and whispered, "Yes, sweetie, we made it."